Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Heather Conley. I'm Senior Vice President here for Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic. And this represents the first Arctic event of 2017 here at CSIS. The sun has come out and we are ready to go. What a timely moment as we head into the final months of the U.S. chairmanship of the Arctic Council, a new administration that will look at Arctic issues anew. And of course, the Arctic represents an incredibly dynamic region, not only from the impact of climate change, but from economic dynamics, and of course, what we're going to speak about today, which is the security dynamics. I can think of no better way to begin this conversation than with a leading thought leader in the Senate, Senator Dan Sullivan. We are so delighted that you could be with us. Senator Sullivan has assumed his position in January of 2015. He sits on 4 critical Senate committees: the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, the Environment and Public Works Committee, Veterans Affairs, and of course, the Senate Armed Services Committee. He is known for many, many years that the United States is an Arctic nation because he has served Alaska so clearly as a dedicated public servant, as Attorney General, and as Commissioner of Alaska's Department of Natural Resources. We know Senator Sullivan a little closer to home when he served at the State Department as Assistant Secretary for Economics, Environment, and Business Affairs, and he also served at the National Security Council. In his spare time, he is a reservist in the United States Marine Corps. He makes us all feel like underachievers. So, Senator Sullivan, we are delighted you are here. Senator Sullivan has been a strong voice. I would say diplomatically, he has encouraged the Department of Defense to think strategically about the Arctic. Undiplomatically, I would tell you he's been pushing them to think more clearly about the security implications of the Arctic. In fact, in the last year's National Defense Authorization Act, he went beyond sort of the platitudes of looking at the Arctic security environment, and he pushed the Defense Department to develop a strategy for the Arctic. Now, unfortunately, the unclassified portion of this report has not been yet available for release. We anticipated that it would. It's hit some snags. So we're going to talk about it in general terms, and as soon as the Defense Department releases it, we will make sure we send it out to you. But we are delighted that we can talk about it in very general terms. Following Senator Sullivan's remarks, we're going to invite Admiral Gary Roughead and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Jim Townsend for a deeper dive into these issues. Senator Sullivan has to escape to do some work on the Senate, but we are delighted, Senator, that you are here. What a timely moment, what a great audience. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Senator Sullivan.
Okay, thank you, Heather, and thanks for that kind introduction. And I want to thank you not only for organizing this event today, but for all your great work and testifying from the Armed Services Committee and on so many issues, but on the Arctic issues in particular. It's great having such an expert. I also want to thank Admiral Roughead and Jim Townsend for their participation today and their literally decades of service to our nation. I think Jim just retired 3 days ago. You can see the burden lifted off his shoulders. So I appreciate them being here as well. The efforts of CSIS and others, I think, are starting to bear fruit on the issue of people, not only in the U.S., but across the globe, starting to understand the importance of the Arctic in a whole bunch of different areas. Now, from my perspective, this recognition in the U.S. has taken some time, and I do again want to commend CSIS, the Hoover Institution, where Admiral Roughead serves, as doing a great job on really getting the word out and educating. Obviously, as the U.S. Senator from Alaska, and yes, there are places in Alaska where you can see Russia. I've taken a keen interest in this issue, but it's not just an interest in my state's future. I see the future in the Arctic that impacts all of the United States and indeed many parts of the world. And because of Alaska, the United States is an Arctic nation, and the future of the Arctic, I think, is going to have an important impact for all of us. So today, as Heather mentioned, I'm going to be previewing a draft of the Department of Defense's new Arctic strategy. Hopefully DOD is going to have that out soon. As a matter of fact, some of you might know one of the elements of this event was to actually have the strategy here for all of you, the unclassed version. But as Admiral Roughhead knows, the saying in the military is, no battle plan survives first contact. So it was not ready to go this morning, but I'm going to tell you what's in it anyway, so hopefully DOD won't mind. Let me begin by describing what I see as what the stakes are in the Arctic. And I think you can kind of look at those in 5 different areas: resources, transportation routes, strategic location, the environment, and yes, people. People live there. But resources, I think a lot of us understand what's at stake. But particularly with regard to oil and gas resources in the world, the U.S. Geological Survey has estimated that the Arctic region has approximately still to be discovered 90 billion barrels. By the way, this is all conventional estimates. None of it's unconventional, which the numbers would go through the roof if you talked about unconventional resources. 90 billion barrels of oil, almost 1,700 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and 44 billion barrels of natural gas liquids. That's a lot of energy. About 13% of the world's undiscovered conventional oil resources, and about 30% of the gas. Those are the estimates by the U.S. Geological Survey. In Alaska's waters alone, there's an estimate of over 24 billion barrels of conventional oil and 108 trillion cubic feet of gas just off the coast of Alaska. Enormous resources. And it's not just oil and gas. As you know, in the waters around Alaska and Russia, some of the most bountiful fisheries in the world as well. So enormous resources. Transportation. As for transportation, Prime Minister Putin has predicted Arctic shipping routes along Russia's northern coast will someday rival the Suez Canal as a quicker trade link from Europe to Russia. And in some ways, you're starting to see that happening. A couple years ago, the Panamanian flag vessel, the Nordic Barents, sailed through the Northern Sea route from Norway to China. It saved 18 days versus the Suez Canal route. And just one ship saved over $300,000 in terms of fuel costs, in terms of transportation. That's one ship. So this is going to continue to happen. And indeed, the increase in commercial traffic as sea lanes open up and the ice recedes is happening to include not just commercial vessels, but tourism. Some of you may have followed, we certainly did in Alaska, the route of the Crystal Serenity, an enormous cruise ship last summer that went from Alaska to New York City through the Arctic. So it's pretty exciting. It was also during the 100th anniversary of the Titanic, and so a number of us were holding our breath. But the Crystal Serenity did a fine job, but that's going to continue. So that's transportation. Strategic location. Some of you historians here, military historians, might remember the famous quote from General Billy Mitchell, the father of the U.S. Air Force, who talked about the Arctic, and Alaska in particular, is the most strategic place in the world because you can access North America, Europe, Asia, quickly, all from all from the location on the top of the world. And for that reason, just my hometown of Anchorage globally is the 4th largest cargo hub in terms of air cargo in the world. So you see that strategic location. Just one example, a lot of Americans don't look at it this way, but it takes 7.5 hours to get from Anchorage to Seoul via aircraft. That trip is almost 12 hours from San Francisco. So you see the strategic location, and that's also very, very important. Environment, that's the 4th area. It's often described, the environment in the Arctic, as pristine. I would call it more rugged. And certainly it's important to protect the environment. We're proud of the high environmental standards that we have in Alaska and the United States on resource development in that region. And of course, the final of the 5 areas of what's at stake in the Arctic are the people. In America, those are my constituents, and they're great people, wonderful people, some of whom have been living in the Arctic for literally thousands of years. And one thing that I think sometimes gets lost is when we talk about the Arctic, the people live there and they need to make a living. And I think if you look at the biggest failure in the past several years when it comes to the Arctic, is that government officials, particularly in the Obama administration, forgot about this element of the Arctic, the people. In some ways, we were seen as kind of a snow globe or a green screen to make big announcements on the Arctic, but no real focus or concerns or input from the very real families and people that live in the Arctic. And if anything needs to change, that needs to change. So these are the stakes, and I think they're increasing in importance. Some have even written about the Arctic as the next geostrategic great game area, given their importance. So what has been our national security strategy in the Arctic? Well, I think until recently, from the U.S. perspective, from the DoD perspective, it really hasn't existed. In 2013, the Department of Defense put out a 13-page brochure disguised as a strategy. Double-spaced with seemingly more pictures and maps than actual content. It talked about climate change 5 times. It talked about Russia once in a footnote. To be honest, it wasn't a serious document. It wasn't a serious strategy. And everybody knew it. Even the Obama administration knew it and admitted it as much. So 2 years ago around this time, we had an Armed Services Committee hearing, and I asked a very simple question of the newly confirmed Secretary of Defense, Secretary Carter. My question was, the Russians are putting major troops and infrastructure in the Arctic. Does that concern you? And to Secretary Carter's credit, he answered by saying, the Arctic is going to be a place of growing strategic importance. The Russians are very active there. We are an Arctic power, and our Arctic strategy needs to be more than just a pamphlet. So, this is Secretary Carter, and I thought he got it. And to his credit, he did. At the same hearing, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey, put it more bluntly. I will say the Russians have just taken a decision to activate 6 new combat brigades, and 4 of them are Arctic combat brigades. So this is 2 years ago. And you started to see the United States finally waking up. In fact, that was the first time senior officials at the Pentagon talked openly about the importance of an Arctic strategy and the militarization of the Arctic by Russia, which is clearly happening. So let me talk about Russia. They clearly had and have a strategy. They clearly recognized what the stakes in the Arctic were, and importantly, from their perspective, they weren't just talking, they were taking action on the ground. So again, I want to just applaud Heather and others at CSIS for helping members of Congress and other policymakers realize this and start to see this. Over the last 2 years, Russia has continued its massive buildup of the Arctic. If you just look at the graph here, It's a little hard to read, but as General Dempsey noted, 4 new Arctic Brigade combat teams, a new Arctic Command, 14 new operational airfields with a goal of 50 airfields by 2020, 16 deep water ports, 40 icebreakers with 11 additional icebreakers in development, some of those nuclear powered. In addition, they have made huge land claims in the Arctic, increased long-range air patrols with their Bear bombers, and we see that in Russia, we see that in Alaska, but some of our NATO allies like Norway have seen that. They increase their surface-to-air missile presence with the most advanced SAMs in the world. And in March 2015, they held a SNAP military exercise with, get this, 45,000 troops, 3,300 military vehicles, 41 ships, 15 submarines, and 110 aircraft. So something's going on in the Arctic. Something serious is going on in the Arctic. Speaking to a reporter just last week, here's how the Russian Northern Fleet commander summed up Russians' intentions in the Arctic. Defending the national interest of Russia in the Arctic will be a priority activity of the Northern Fleet Command in 2017. And it's not just Russia. China has also shown a growing interest in the Arctic for the reasons we talked about: resources, transportation routes, strategic location. And in August 2015, when President Obama visited Alaska for 3 days, China sent 3 Navy ships through Alaska's territorial waters. And if you think that was just a coincidence, I've got a bridge in Brooklyn I'd like to sell you. So there's a lot of interest going on right now. All of this has been a bipartisan concern of members of the Armed Services Committee, and I think this is an important development. For a number of years, when the Arctic was being talked about in policy circles in the United States or in the Congress, it seemed as if it was just the senators from Alaska, the congressmen from Alaska. That's changed. Everybody from the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, Democrats and Republicans in the Senate, in the House, have raised this issue and have voiced concerns about this issue. So what are we doing? Well, I would say we started to get to work. And as Admiral Roughead knows, sometimes the Pentagon is ahead of policymakers, ahead of Congress on important issues. Other times it's the other way around, where Congress comes in and, tries to raise issues. And I think this is one where we were doing that and the Pentagon was following. So in the FY 2016 NDAA, a number of us got together, Senator King, myself, others, to submit to DoD the requirement for an updated military strategy for the protection of United States national interests in the Arctic region. And this element of the DoD NDAA required DoD to formulate how it would mitigate the operational seams between the combatant commanders in the Arctic. So if you look at the Arctic and where our COCOM seams are, you have so many different combatant commands in the United States: NORTHCOM, PACOM, EUCOM, STRATCOM, all having a piece of the Arctic. And most importantly, in that provision of the NDAA, we spelled out the DoD, quote, must provide a description of operational plans and associated military requirements for the protection of United States national security interests in the Arctic region, including United States citizens, territory, freedom of navigation, economic and trade interests. So, what we have and what we have coming out and what's going to be released to the public soon is our new strategy based on the requirements that were put forth by the Senate Armed Services Committee, by the U.S. Congress, to the Department of Defense. I can tell you, in having read it, that it's a much more serious strategy. It's much longer, it's much more detailed. It mentions Russia at least 25 times with an entire section on Russia. And importantly, it acknowledges a common threat in the Arctic. And that's just the unclassed version. There's also a classified annex, which is a serious document. All in all, I believe it's a good start. But that said, we need to do a lot more work on the actual strategy to deal with our interests there. So what's in this new strategy, and importantly, what's not in it? Let me begin by highlighting some of the elements, important elements in this document that were not in the last one, that were not in the brochure. And there's many. First, unlike the former document, this new strategy talks about friction points with Russia in the Arctic, including their claims of sovereignty. Second, the document identifies what Russia's national interests are in the Arctic and says clearly that Russia will use Arctic as a natural strategic resource base to support and develop the Northern Sea Route for transportation. Now, I think this is about controlling the Northern Sea Route for transportation, and that's already starting to happen. Third, it identifies a need for enhancing the capability of U.S. forces in the Arctic to defend the homeland and exercise sovereignty. This includes a growing need for a maritime warning mission in the area within NORAD with the Canadians. And finally, within the new 2016 strategy, there is a section on preserving freedom of seas in the Arctic. This section states, quote, "In support of the U.S. national security interests in preserving all the rights, freedoms, and uses of the sea and airspace recognized under international law, DoD will preserve the global mobility of U.S. military and civilian vessels and aircraft throughout the Arctic as in other regions. This includes conducting freedom of navigation operations to challenge excessive maritime claims when and where necessary." So why is this important? Well, as most of you know, freedom of navigation, freedom of the seas, is American as apple pie. Just read the Declaration of Independence, read the Constitution. This concept is embedded in our founding documents as a core United States interest. And yet, for 3 years, the U.S. did not conduct one freedom of navigation operation, or FONOP, in the South China Sea, one of the most important commercial transportation routes in the world. And what happened? For 3 years, China reclaimed land, built islands, militarized them, and changed the strategic conditions on the ground, the strategic conditions in the region. The chairman of the Armed Services Committee, John McCain, said this very well in an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal last year on the Arctic after a visit to the region. He said, quote, "Russia's military expansion in the Arctic and North Atlantic appears to be an attempt to establish de facto control over these vital areas, much as China is seeking to do in the South China Sea. In both cases, the U.S. response so far has been feeble. Our nation's responses should not be feeble, whether in the South China Sea or in the Arctic. And while this new Arctic strategy is finally a promising and long-awaited step in the right direction, we cannot afford to be idle. We cannot afford to continue to cede strategic initiatives to others in the Arctic. So what are the next steps? Where do we go from here? Well, I think we can learn a lot from the Russians, because they're not just talking, they're taking action. So my broader strategic areas of concern of the Arctic are the following. First, communications and domain awareness. Given the increasing commercial and military activity in the Arctic region, current Department of Defense capabilities do not yet provide sufficient communication and domain awareness in the region. And again, to its credit, the new strategy document acknowledges these shortfalls. We need to work to address those. Second, search and rescue capability. We have the ability to rescue up to 50 people if there's an incident in the Arctic. Well, that wouldn't have worked had the Crystal Serenity run into problems last summer. The 2016 strategy does discuss the need for rapidly deployable airdrop response sustainment packages to remote areas of the Arctic to help and search and rescue. More needs to be done. And more needs to be done, by the way, in conjunction with the nations of the Arctic, including Russia. And there has been some progress in that area. Third, infrastructure. As mentioned earlier, Russia is investing in dozens of ports and airfields in the Arctic. Meanwhile, the nearest DoD, Department of Defense, strategic seaport in the Arctic region are the ports of Anchorage, my hometown, and the port of Tacoma, located respectively 1,500 nautical miles or 2,400 nautical miles away from key Arctic areas. We are very infrastructure poor in America's Arctic. For that reason, in the most recent NDAA that was just signed into law last month, Senator King and I authored a provision for the designation by the Secretary of Defense for a strategic Arctic port in consultation with the Coast Guard and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. This designation would create a strategic imperative for limited investment for surge type of infrastructure in the Arctic to allow DoD and the Coast Guard to better respond to missions like maritime control and defense, search and rescue, and oil spill response. The fourth area that we need to focus on is protecting sea routes. We should be investing in both medium and heavy class icebreakers. That's how you control the commercial sea routes in the Arctic. The Russians know this. As I noted earlier, 40 icebreakers with at least 11 more in development. The United States has 2, and 1 is broken. The Coast Guard has asked for 6, 3 medium and 3 heavies in terms of icebreakers. The last year's Department of Defense appropriations bill has $1 billion set aside for icebreakers. The highways of the Arctic are icebreakers. Right now, the Russians have superhighways, and we have dirt roads with potholes. As President Trump looks at dramatically increasing the size of the Navy to 350 vessels, I would submit that some of these new vessels should be ice-hardened. They do not all have to be icebreakers capability, but they should have some type of ability to operate in environments with lots of sea ice. Fifth and finally, in terms of areas of concern, we have to get serious about our own interests in the Arctic. Here's an irony for you. The report specifically cites the need to develop our resources in the Arctic in an environmentally sustainable manner, in a way that advantageously positions the U.S. for economic growth. It's a great point. I couldn't agree more with that point. It might have been at the exact time of the writing of that section when President Obama in December announced that he was locking up all of the ocean of the Arctic for the United States. The Chukchi and Beaufort Seas that, as I mentioned, have enormous natural resources. Yet, in a unilateral decision with no consultation with the Senate or the Congress or the members who live in the Arctic, like myself, our own president said all of these resources are going to be taken off the table. We're not going to develop them. You could almost hear the Russians laughing. Even the Canadians who did this jointly with the United States said, we're going to review this in 5 years. Our White House trumpeted the fact that this is off the table indefinitely. And of course, nothing is indefinite. So we need to get serious about our own resources in the Arctic. This will help our country, help energy security, help our national security, and yes, help the environment. I was the Commissioner of Natural Resources and Energy in Alaska. I guarantee you, in that region, we have the highest standards in the world on protecting the environment. When we close down our Arctic resources and the ability to develop them, all we do is send investment to other places and other jurisdictions, like Russia, who don't have nearly the standards or the care or the interest in protecting their Arctic environment that we do. So this unilateral disarmament in terms of our own resources has to stop. Energy can play a fundamental role as an instrument of American power, diplomacy, and national security, and I'm certainly hopeful that the Trump administration seems to understand the importance of the Arctic, including its energy potential. I've had very productive talks with the nominee for Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, who last year was the point person briefing senators on the Hill on the National Petroleum Council's very broad-based report on Arctic resources. And during his nomination process, I asked our new Secretary of Defense, General Mattis, about the Arctic. And in a question he submitted for the record, he stated, quote, "The Arctic is key strategic terrain. Russia is taking aggressive steps to increase its presence there. I will prioritize the development of an integrated strategy for the Arctic. I believe that our interests in the security of the Arctic would benefit from increasing the focus of the Department of Defense on this region. I am hopeful that the Secretary of Defense and the Department of Defense release their Arctic strategy soon so all of you can analyze it, criticize it, build on it. But I think we can all agree we have a lot of work to do in this very important region. So Heather, thank you again, and I really appreciate everybody coming out to hear some of our issues, our concerns, and opportunities that we have in the Arctic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. You've been very gracious to take one or two questions, and then we're going to very quickly start our panel discussion. So if anyone has any questions, if you could raise your hand and give us your name and affiliation and make that question ever so brief. Sir, we have one right there and then one in the middle. We'll take those two. Max right there. Wait for the microphone, please. Thank you.
Senator, you said that your view was that the ban was indefinite.
And can you identify yourself?
Sorry, Oliver Williams from FTI Consulting. You said that in your view, the ban was indefinite. I'm interested to know whether or not you think that the a 5-year leasing plan can be implemented before the ban has been overturned.
Well, look, we're looking at a lot of options. We've had discussions with the incoming Trump administration on not only the 5-year leasing plan, but on what the president just did with regard to the designation of locking up both the Chukchi and Beaufort Seas. My own view, and we're looking at this hard, that the legal authority he had to do that is questionable. Remember, he took that action under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. That act states that it's the policy of the United States to expeditiously develop the OCS resources in an orderly manner. That's the policy in law. So to have the executive, despite the fact that that's the policy, take an entire ocean off the table through what's called Section 12 of that act. That's been used before for smaller areas to designate, hey, we're going to take this off the table. This is a sensitive area for environmental reasons. But to take an entire ocean, 2 seas, off the table, I think that there's a lot of legal questions whether he had the authority to do that. So we're looking at a whole host of ways to try to reverse that. And the fact that the Obama White House said that that was indefinite, that's ridiculous. Nothing's indefinite. You can change the Constitution in America if you wanted to. So an outgoing president's executive order is never indefinite. And we're looking at ways to reverse that.
And one last question there.
Senator Keith Weaver from Northrop Grumman. You mentioned strategy, and you mentioned 2016, and you mentioned what we're doing now with General Mattis and those things. But you also showed a graphic up there of what the Russians are doing. Yeah. As far as we saw aircraft, we saw ships and things happening. When does strategy and what you're doing strategically, thinking-wise, be overcome by events when the Russians are continuing to move, and they may have a very basic strategy, but they're moving?
No, it's a great question, right? And it's the point that I mentioned that might sound a little surprising, but I think we can learn from the Russians. They clearly have a strategy, and then they're implementing it with action, a lot of action. And what we need to do, putting forward a strategy is important, but what we need to do is to start acting. And you know, I was very encouraged by President Trump's inauguration, a speech where he talked about action. But I think, you know, we're going to be tested here, because just like in the South China Sea, if we're not defending our interest, if we're not undertaking FONOPs, it's not as if the rest of the world is waiting for us. They're changing the facts on the ground. And if the sea lanes continue to open and become strategic, and Russia can completely control and dominate that, that should be a concern for everybody with regard to international commerce. Now, as I mentioned, that's why I thought it was very helpful that the strategy does highlight the importance of freedom of navigation and underscores that that's an important interest that we have from a Department of Defense strategy. And I think that's an advancement relative to the previous document. So we're getting there on strategy, but as you rightfully mentioned, it's not just strategy, it's actually the implementation of it. And we're going to continue to focus on that.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.
What do you want us to say?
Carrie, why don't you go over there to my, I'm going to sit between you two. Senator Sullivan, thank you so much. What a wonderful way to start off a conversation, and thank you for staying with us for a few more minutes until you have to go back to the Capitol. I am so privileged to be joined by two colleagues that I look to when I'm scratching my head and thinking about the Arctic and Northern Europe strategically. On my left, Admiral Gary Roughead, Robert and Marion Oster Distinguished Military Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Many of you know Admiral Roughead when he served as Chief of Naval Operations beginning in 2007, one of two naval officers in our history that have served as both the head of the Atlantic and the Pacific fleets. And that, in fact, is the best job training for the Arctic as it crosses both the Atlantic and the Pacific. So we are so grateful. And of course, Jim Townsend, newly liberated from distinguished government service. We jokingly named Jim Mr. NATO, because he has served with such distinguished service as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. You've served at NATO headquarters, you've been Principal Director, every position. And you have really developed some of the most innovative thinking about U.S. defense and security cooperation in Northern Europe. So as I said, what a privilege to have the two of you. I'm very mindful of our time, and I wanted to be able to pick both of your brains. Again, my apologies to the audience. We've sort of had a little bit of a sneak peek into the unclassified portions of this report in anticipation that it would be released today. And I wanted to draw on a couple of areas that I would like your help in understanding. And we begin with, in fact, the question that Senator Sullivan asked Secretary Mattis during his confirmation hearing. Senator Sullivan basically asked, so what are Russia's intentions? Why all of this military buildup? Secretary Mattis said, I don't know. So let me, if you were in the hot seat testifying before Senator Sullivan, Admiral Roughead, what would you say are Russia's intentions?
My view is that Russia wants to assure its strategic space in the Arctic. It wants to be the controller over the Northern Sea Route, and it wants to be assured that it has access to the resources that are in the Arctic. And I would go so far as to say that we have to disabuse ourselves that the resources in the Arctic are all about gas and oil. The mineral deposits that are there, rare earths that are on the bottom, all of these will become increasingly important as we move into the future. and Russia sees that as its space. I would also submit that Russia's partnership or relationship with China and the demand for resources that China will have will also form a further relationship in the Arctic. I believe that we'll see China more interested in those resources and in the and an energy source that it will need. Clearly, it also sees the importance of the protein stocks that the senator mentioned. And so I think China will be moving there. And in a way, I could envision in the resource and the economic area, Russia almost becoming the junior partner, China the senior partner in this. And so when we look at the Arctic, it's not just about Russia. It's more broad, and we have to think of it strategically in that way.
Well, I was saying one thing, at least in the portions that I was able to read, China is not mentioned in DoD strategy, and I think that's an important part as they are testing the transpolar route annually, which goes beyond the Northern Sea route and the Russian exclusive economic zone, and of course the incredible commercial activity around the Yamal Peninsula and the Yamal LNG mega project. Jim, you're in the hot seat, and I bet you might have had a little something to do with this strategy, or at least overseen it a little bit.
Not the pamphlet.
Not the pamphlet. Okay.
But the
he
bigger
disavows
one,
the pamphlet.
the good one, we were very involved. Well, thank you, Heather. Thank you for the nice introduction as well. And Senator, I thought your speech was excellent. I agreed with every point. You know, what are the Russians up to? I think General Mattis gave the right response in the sense that we don't know. I think what Admiral Roughead said, I would agree, if in terms of trying to give a good, educated guess. I think what the Admiral says is absolutely right. But there's 2 points. One is that what we don't know particularly, and this is, I think, it was what's behind saying, I don't know what he's up to, is we don't necessarily know how far he's going to go. We know that there's been a lot of rhetoric about developing these military forces. We know that he's activating some of the old Soviet facilities that are there. We know that he's not put in a lot of the infrastructure that we thought would come with some of the rhetoric. So we know that he is getting more active up there, just what the senator said. His rhetoric certainly says that. And so we've got to watch and see just how far he's willing to go to make those investments up there, because he's got other requirements like we do on his forces, whether it's in Syria or whether it is doing other things around the globe. You know, the Arctic is going to be a competitor as well for resources. So how much are the Russians willing to devote in terms of resources is something that we're going to have to really examine to see truly where he's going. But I think the most important point, I think this is where the senator is coming from, is that we have not paid enough attention up there for a long time. It's not like we didn't know that this was something we had to keep our eye on. The Arctic itself, particularly search and rescue, this type of thing, we've always tried to keep from militarizing things up there. But that began to slide over time, and we knew that there had to be a DoD focus, a deeper focus than there had been in the past. But again, it's a competition for not just resources from DoD, but the attention span as well. Because there is a competition for how much as the secretary and the service chiefs and the strategists, as we look at where we need to be putting our defense resources, there's a competition for bandwidth, if you will, for attention. And I think the Arctic has been starved too long. And we see that in other areas too, where all of a sudden something happens to bring our attention to it, and then we find ourselves playing catch up. And so that's where we are right now. So no matter how far we think they are going or not, or that's got to be governed, what we do has got to be governed by that, but there are things we need to be doing right now, regardless. And I think the icebreaker point is a very good one. Strategy in terms of how we're going to approach problems up there. I think this report that will very shortly be released, if I were still in my old job, I'd go back and really, you know, poor Esther, I'd be right on her, Rob, you know. But I think we're getting there. The problem is that we're in a hole, and we've got to dig ourselves out. One last point, and I'm saying this because I'm sure Admiral Roughead is thinking this himself. And this is not a political statement, this is just a fact, and that is sequestration really hurt us. And it put us deeper in a hole. And when we had the Russians go into Crimea, that all of a sudden gave UCOM particularly a whole new planning front to have to deal with. As a COCOM, all of a sudden they became a combatant commander. Okay. You had that happening. The Navy itself, I know because I went to see the Deputy CNO right after Crimea, and I said, we've got to have more Navy ships going into theater, and she told me, look, a lot of our ships are having to go through maintenance that was deferred, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're in a hole. There's a lot of different reasons for it, but the new administration has got to take care of that sequestration problem. And has got to get the budgets back to where they need to go so we can do the things that the senator has laid out, and I'm sure that Admiral Roughead would have loved to do as well, but we were constrained by the resources that we had.
I think we have to stop from a reactive to a proactive and start returning strategically to the region. One region that's catching our attention, and you know, we've all been sort of brought forward in a lot of Cold War terminology, compromat, active measures. Here's your next one. GI-UK gap, Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom gap. Now, there's a generation of thinkers that go, what's that? And why do we have to worry about Russian submarine activity in the GI-UK gap? So Admiral Roughead, a lot of attention is back on the North Atlantic. We're doing some thinking about that as well. We don't have the resources. We've never left the region, but quite frankly, we never thought we'd go back to a more contested area. Help our audience understand the importance of the GI-UK gap.
Yeah, I think that as we look at the world, and you can expect I would say this given my background, we tend to, in a way, look at problems through a straw, whether it's in the Middle East or in the South China Sea, very narrow focus. And I would submit that we have to look more broadly at what moves on the world, and we have to connect it with the sea lanes that are so important. And when you look at where Russian forces are, and how they have to get into the main operating areas of the world, they have to come through certain choke points and gaps. I mean, that's been the case throughout history. And so I think as we look at the world today, and I would disagree with you, Heather, we have not been in the North Atlantic, much the same as we have not been in the Mediterranean. And a lot of it is a function of force structure. To be sure. But I think we have to look more broadly at where are the strategic locations, choke points, and how do we prepare for that. A few years ago, I think it was about midway through my tenure, we issued something called the Arctic Roadmap, which was really an idea that I wanted to get people thinking about the Arctic and beginning to think about the investments that needed to be made. And many of those investments can be used in other areas. For example, the domain awareness, which the Senator hit on, which is so important. We will not do anything in the Arctic if we don't know what the hell is up there and what's moving up there. Domain awareness is important. That domain awareness can move to other locations, but in the Arctic it has to be designed to be able to operate up at those high latitudes. And so, you know, we really need to think about what we're buying. For example, the Senator also mentioned ice-hardened ships. I would be bold to recommend to the Armed Services Committee that as we look at new classes of ships, they should be ice-hardened. An ice-hardened ship can operate in the Middle East. A non-ice-hardened ship cannot operate in the Arctic. So let's begin to think in terms of that, and it's more than just the hull. I mean, the whole environmental systems on the ships have to change. Because the Arctic, let's face it, although it's cleared, it is still a tough, tough place, a hard place to operate. So I think, you know, those are some of the things that we have to do. I would also argue that, yes, we do an exercise on occasion in the Arctic. Why don't we deploy a unit to the Arctic for 4 months? It will only be until you're up there operating. And then, you know, the whole issues of communication and the Arctic, more than any other place, is where unmanned and where our innovation, where our technology in unmanned systems should really rip. Because of the harshness, because of the challenges, that's where you need to really focus on manned capabilities. And as I said, they can go elsewhere. But if you design for the equator, it's not going to work up north.
That's a great point. Jim, one of the strong elements of this strategy talked about that the U.S. engagement with allies and partners is our center of gravity. And what concerned me, certainly that is absolutely true, and I couldn't underscore it more. The problem is allies aren't going to defend U.S. territorial sovereignty issues. How do you enhance U.S. engagement with partners in the Arctic? And I'm thinking of our natural Arctic allies, Norway, and obviously our non-NATO partners, Sweden and Finland. But that doesn't get us back to what the U.S. capabilities are. What was some of your thinking as sort of how do we build allies and partners and strengthening Arctic security?
Well, it's a great question, and I think in the first instance it really illustrates the issue we have with the seams that the senator talked about, and I know Admiral Ruffett has had to wrestle with as well. The senator was certainly talking about it from an Alaska point of view. NORTHCOM, it works that, but then you have Canada, another ally who's quite the Arctic power as well. They've got a certain view. You roll east, as you were talking about the GI-UK gap, and we had 2 hours. I would love to talk about that.
We'll have you back. We'll do it again.
We can talk about that. But you have Greenland, of course, with Denmark. You've got Iceland. You've got Norway. Particularly Sweden and Finland. We can talk about it as a package in a second. But you have this problem of a focus that's fragmented. I mean, just the fact that I'm sitting here talking about the Arctic is another illustration of it. I'm the Deputy Secretary for Europe and NATO. So why am I here listening to a senator from Alaska talk about, because we have this problem of how do you deal with the Arctic when you've got so many claimants. And I will tell you, within the Pentagon, the Arctic as an issue, certainly within OSD policy, which is where I come out of, it's a bit of an orphan when it comes to an issue. There's not an office of Arctic strategy. There is a person who worked in the strategy office that worked on Arctic issues. She's now in our office, and she's great, and she was a major producer of this report. So your question really does illustrate that there's a lot of players here, a lot of parties here, and we're not going to be able to do the kinds of things the senator has talked about unless we can somehow organize a focused effort just because of the resource requirement. And what I mean by that, particularly in my part of the world, is you've got NATO allies, and I can tell you, Norway particularly is very vocal within the alliance about domain awareness, situational awareness. If something happens up in the GI-UK gap, up in North Norway, are the allies able to come up here? Is there enough understanding of the operational conditions up here? And you've got an alliance that's saying, well, okay, we'll put this in the hopper with everything else, but we already have problems, as you know, within the alliance with having enough capability provided by allies to do this, just the level of ambition that NATO has. So if you put the Arctic on there as well, that's a lot to be done. So I think if I were to, as I will talk to my successor, and we talk about the Arctic, we've got to come up with a focused way of dealing with this, whether it is from a U.S. vantage point, U.S. working with Finland and Sweden, who are not, they don't have quite the Arctic that, say, Norway does, or Denmark when it comes to Greenland. But they've got to play in this, and we've got to have these nations, including Canada, that are pretty well off, but aren't putting a lot of their resources into defense. I mean, Canada is struggling with that, and we're going to have us focused and saying, how can we, in an efficient way, all of us provide the security and the resources to meet the requirements we know are up there in the Arctic. We can go to NATO right now, as Norway has tried to do and is doing, and Denmark is there as well, but Norway certainly is the one pushing for changes in the command structure and other things at NATO to try to at least lay the foundation for a better Arctic, operating condition for the alliance should they have to go up there. So Norway's pushing for that. I don't think it's getting the traction it needs, quite frankly, because everyone is, you got the southern allies worried about the migrant issue coming across. Turkey's worried about Syria. Lots of views of Russia as it comes to Poland and comes to the Baltics, not necessarily up in the Arctic. The GI-UK gap, though, ties a lot of that together because that's both the United States and Canada. It's also the European allies up in the Nordic-Baltic area, and that they all come together with concerns about the GI-UK gap. So there are things that tie us together, but we will never be able to put together the resources and the approach that we need up in the Arctic from Alaska all the way going east unless we do it in a coordinated fashion. It's not just NATO, and it's not just the U.S. We got to do it as a region.
Absolutely, Gary. I would love you to come in.
And I think this is where some innovative thinking has to take place. And you know, for example, when you talk about the domain awareness network, Canada should be tied in, Norway should be tied in, Denmark should be tied in. Be able to share that type of technology. You know, will the sharing of costs be equitable in people's minds? I mean, you'd have to work through that. You know, for example, why shouldn't the U.S. and Canada engage in a Arctic patrol vessel program?
Right.
And maybe it's a common design, and let's be realistic, our shipyards in both countries will have to be employed, so it's a build in each country. But common design, common communication architectures. I think we need to do that. I would also say, and I will be very frank in saying that I think our last 2 years of chairing the Arctic Council, to me, was very disappointing. I was hopeful when we took over the chairmanship that we really would be able to see a conversation emerge in the country where we identified ourselves as an Arctic nation. In all honesty, once you get out of Alaska, it's kind of lost. And in a way, I think a lot of it is because we have lost the inspiration and the challenge of frontiers. When you think of the Arctic and the harshness and the challenges that we face up there, you know, the American approach has always been to conquer those frontiers, and we've kind of let that atrophy in my mind. I was hopeful that we would see a re-energizing of that and an articulation of why the Arctic was important and to challenge us in that regard. So I think, you know, that's key. We talk about DOD, but in a paper I did a while back, you know, my view is we also should look at the State Department. And right now, when you look at the Western Hemisphere, that's a pretty long stretch. And one of the recommendations I made, and when you're in retirement, you can make all kinds of recommendations, and you know,
I'm looking forward to
that. You know, my view is that we should split that Western Hemisphere Bureau and state to a North American Bureau and a Southern Hemisphere Bureau, and that North American Bureau would then be the one that would deal with Arctic issues and all of the associated interactions that take place up in that high north area.
Yeah.
Give that bureau more bandwidth to work on things that are going to be hugely important, whether it's economically or from a security region, or from dealing with agreements on indigenous populations and health. Those are some of the things that I think we really need to look more broadly across the government. How do we organize ourselves? How do we re-inspire ourselves to conquer this frontier, not in a negative way, but to be able to go in and develop it and operate as a matter of routine?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think the last 8 years that CSIS has been diving into this issue, we can talk about it in broad terms, but it lacks priority. It lacks focus. It lacks drive, energy, enthusiasm. We can do this. We're talking about it. We evaluate it. We assess. We think. But it is about taking those steps.
Right.
But I agree with you. We have a structural issue. And in some ways, it's my job title. Everyone goes, say what? You know, Europe, Arctic, and it does not fit neatly regionally. It does not fit neatly functionally because of environmental issues, security, economic issues, but I will say it is the most fascinating area and so dynamic. Let me dig a little deeper into the structural issue, and forgive me for being a hair arcane, but the strategy focuses a bit on this. It's what Senator Sullivan mentioned about these operational seams. And I'm going to put a provocative thought on the table. I do not believe the Unified Command Plan for the Arctic works. So just in brief, so NORTHCOM has an advocacy role, EUCOM has an operational role, and PACOM sort of is not really there anymore. I don't think that works. I don't think NORTHCOM can advocate when it's not going to be necessarily advantageous to them. The operational theater is Europe. That's why you get it. That's why I get it in many ways because of the Russia challenge. But the North Pacific, the Bering Strait, as you mentioned, stepping back and taking a much broader look at the strategic choke points. The Bering Strait could be one of those. That's a PACOM thing. That's about the Chinese Russian military exercises 2 summers ago in Vladivostok and then off the Aleutian Islands. Can we restructure this? Is there a reform effort? And then to add on top of that, just to complicate it, we have our own operational issues. The Coast Guard is the tip of the spear here on maritime domain awareness, the icebreaker challenge. SAR. I know DOD and DHS have this MOU, but I just see them both going, my budget, careful, it's all good if it comes out of your budget, and we're not thinking strategically, we're thinking parochially. How do you get around that?
Yeah, one of my frustrations was when we talked about the Arctic, at least in my day, and I think you touched on it, we spent more time, and this was within the DoD, about drawing lines in the water than really dealing with the strategic issues. And I think much as what we've done with our Special Operations Command, and we went through this wrestling match a few years ago because of the global nature of the work that they were doing. They pretty much are clearly first among equals in that regard. And I think that we have to make the decision that the Arctic is structured differently. And I would submit, in kind of in the construct of my North American view, that NORTHCOM should not be the advocate. NORTHCOM should be the person. And the Secretary of Defense can easily get the others, in line. But I really think that in the Arctic, because there's such a convergence, and we continue to want to draw the lines like we've drawn them all over the world, the map, in my view, doesn't work well up there. And so I would submit NORTHCOM, you've got it, and others are in support of NORTHCOM. If you were to restructure into a North American State Department construct, you now have some commonality there because guess what? NORTHCOM has Canada and Mexico. And so I think that there are some opportunities to do that. The other point, and it's all well and good to talk about the combatant commands in dealing with the Arctic. The combatant commands don't have money, they don't have forces, they don't develop the future capabilities. And so while we go off and we occupy ourselves with drawing these lines, the hard work of committing resources to investments that give the combatant commands the capabilities kind of passes off on the side. And I think we have to have an honest discussion about that.
Amen. Jim?
It's resources and bandwidth. I mean, it's that simple. We could have our best strategists sit down and lay out just what the Admiral said, which I agree with. Lay out a new approach to the Arctic. We could think strategically. We could draw it out in terms of COCOM boundaries and this type of thing. But if the bandwidth isn't there with the Secretary and the Chairman and others who are having to handle ISIL and a whole host of other problems, maybe they'll have one meeting a month where they're dealing with an Arctic decision here or there, but they're all focused on something else, and that's the NSC staff too. Then we're not going to get anywhere. I mean, so much of the problems over the past 8 years in terms of what we are not able to get at, and it's not just the Arctic, there are other things too. Europe, until the Russians went into Crimea. We weren't able to do these things because of bandwidth of the decision makers, and that's going to be a problem for every administration. It's a problem for the new one as well. And so again, if I were talking to my successor and we were talking about the Arctic, if we will be successful in doing these things, which we do need to be doing in the Arctic, there's got to be a constituency that is loud and knows the tricks of the trade within the bureaucracy to get their positions agreed and to get the resources that they need put into budgets, etc. And there's not that in the Pentagon right now. And so there's other squeaky wheels like special ops or other things that are fighting real fights in Syria and this type of thing, and they're the ones that get the attention. So we've got to get the bandwidth, and then you got to get the resources put towards implementing that strategy. And that takes me back to sequestration, back to the Pentagon budgets. There's so many areas where we need to be replenishing ourselves. That we've got to really, if you're going to be clamoring for the Arctic, that voice has got to be strong within the resource channels in the Pentagon and at OMB and on the Hill, because the resources, there's going to be a very powerful claim on lots of resources from this administration, which is good. We've got a lot of makeup to do. And the Arctic's going to be in there with everybody else. So there's got to be a constituency in there that will be pushing loudly to do the Arctic better than we've been able to do it in the past. Last point is, a few months ago, I was in Helsinki with Deputy Secretary Bob Work and team. We did a lot of Nordic-Baltic things over the past 2 years, which was really live and aimed towards the GI-UK gap. Again, 2 hours, and I could just
We're going to have you back.
tell you
Don't worry.
what's going on. But we took a tour of the newest Finnish icebreaker. Now I can just see the hackles going up among shipbuilders in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. My point here is going back to what Admiral Ruff had said. Certainly an icebreaker would have to be made in the U.S. by U.S. shipyards. And that was the point Bob Work and everybody else made too. And I think the Finns knew that too. But we saw a technology that the Finns have that they used in building this icebreaker that was really eye-opening. I mean, all of us were, including Bob Work, who is a guy who knows this kind of thing, very impressed. And so what we were talking about is, this is an example of something that we could do together. U.S. shipyards working with Canada, developing these things, and I tell you, there's a great blueprint that's across the ocean there with the Finns. And so we don't have to start from scratch. But again, there's politics behind that, there's resources, I'll leave that to others. But that's another example of how we could put together maybe more efficiently an approach that gets us the icebreakers without taking 20 years of going through the politics and ending up with something that's obsolete when it comes off the way. So
well, and my one word of caution on focusing on the procurement of one icebreaker, it doesn't get to all of the structural issues that Senator Sullivan mentioned. It doesn't get you. I mean, yes, it provides an enormously capable platform, but it doesn't get to all of these issues. And my beef with bandwidth. The bandwidth is when we have a crisis.
Right.
And then we all find, oh golly, we've been thinking about this and talking about this, but no one has, it's the urgent versus the important.
It takes Russia going into Crimea to get stuff done in Europe that we should have been doing for the past 10 years.
But that's where we strategically have fallen down. Because if we're waiting for it to happen to spur,
it's too late.
It's too late, and there are too many bright, intelligent people in Washington and other national. We know what's going on. We've just seen the map. The bandwidth should be there, so we need to do more from the outside. But there's a point where you've got to respond to it.
And the bandwidth can be there, but then it's the hard decisions when the bandwidth allows the discussion to be had with the decision makers, and it's up to the SecDef and the president and the budget, and they say, okay, we're taking advantage of this bandwidth to talk about this issue. Now, where are we on the priority for resources? And hard decisions are made, and Arctic ends up number 3.
But to Senator Sullivan's point, this is Congress leading the administration on icebreakers, $1 billion. That is not what the administration came up with. It was $150 million, we hope. It's about forcing, you need a more in-depth strategic document. Come on. Now, this is where Congress, I think, is pulling. Come on. The bandwidth now, I think, has to catch up.
I think there's been a great pressure from the Hill.
And I would also say we have to be realistic about the temporal aspect of what you're talking about. The process that's in place now with $1 billion for an icebreaker, been down this road before. It will be probably, if we hit the start button today, it would be 2031 by
Right.
the time there's an icebreaker in the water operating.
Too late, too late.
2031. That's a long ways away. But if, in addition to what Jim was talking about on the finished design, I would even go so far as to look at ways to gap fill that with a lease of a finish breaker.
Absolutely right.
And that way we learn, it gives us presence, it allows us to look at potential new technology that we may be developing in the area of domain awareness and communication that then could become part of the follow-on. But to start from scratch, and I know that there's great anticipation that the process will be shortened and loosened up because of regulatory change. It's going to be a long while before we see that manifested in our shipbuilding programs.
Right.
And I would offer that one of the things that should be done is to bring the shipbuilders in to say, how would you go about doing these sorts of things with the fins, and then providing the authorizations to allow that to accelerate.
I think that's absolutely right. We've got to be creative about this. I was so bold as after we got off the icebreaker, I turned to Bob Work and I said, let's just buy it off the shelf. Let's just buy it. And of course, everyone went,
No. We need to build it, but we need an interim solution.
Right.
We need the answer between now and 2031.
Yep.
We need to do it smartly, effectively, bringing the best technology, but creating jobs here, and because America needs icebreakers, we need the ports and the shipbuilders to be able to do this. For exactly your point, we need more ice strength.
and this issue of icebreakers has been around for decades. This is not something new.
And I would also say that, the opening of the Arctic, I think a lot of people who don't follow it think that, maybe that diminishes, but I would submit that as the ice breaks and moves,
More
the
dangerous.
need for icebreakers, if you want to move around up there, is actually going to be increasing. Because you'll have activity taking place, the ice will move, the ice will shift, and you have to be able to get that activity cleared and out and about. So having a dialogue about what's happening in the science and what is happening with ice movement, I think it needs to be injected into the icebreaker discussion so that there can be a more informed policy. Because to Heather's point, the stuff is going to hit the fan when a cruise ship sinks up there. And we will be so ill-prepared. And yet there will be an expectation that, whether it's likely the military, why weren't you ready to go?
Right.
And as I look at some of these large cruise ships moving through the ice flows up there, my palms sweat, quite frankly, because I think it's a very risky operation, but people are going to do it.
I participated, and I know we all have, tabletop exercises that look at this. And my takeaway, this was several years ago, and it gets to the point when Senator Sullivan said, we now have the capabilities to rescue 50 people.
Exactly.
I said, really, what the takeaway I had is the National Command Authority better practice telling the Commander-in-Chief what they cannot do in an emergency. They don't have options. Oh, we are 6 days away. We are 6 hours away from, flying from Kodiak to the accident. It drives you crazy because, we are not capable. I could go on forever because I love talking to you guys. We got to bring our audience into this conversation. Right. So let's do a rapid round we'll take some questions, we'll bundle them up, and then I'll let Admiral Roughhead and Jim take a stab at it. But my closeout question, which you can think of as we're collecting question, is what keeps you up at night about Arctic security? What's going to be the surprise that we're not prepared for? But with that, let's see if anyone in our audience has any questions or comments for our colleagues. I have one very in the back, Matt, right there. Please identify yourself.
Liu, Voice of America. Heather, I think you mentioned that China is not mentioned in that soon-to-be-released document. Do you think it's a mistake not to mention China, given what Admiral Roughhead just mentioned, that possibility of Russia and China may work together in the Arctic? Thanks.
Oh, well, I love when the moderator gets a question. You guys get off. Actually, and this, Gary, I welcome your comments on here. Actually, CSIS has started 2 years ago a U.S.-China Arctic Social Science Forum where we're getting its experts, Chinese experts together. They have put forward an enormous amount of research, clearly looking at the economic opportunities, and clearly climate impacts has a dramatic impact on China. As observers to the Arctic Council in 2013, as leading voices in the International Maritime Organization, now that the Polar Code is mandatory, there are enormous amounts, amount of interest in China in the Arctic, and we have a stake in understanding their interest and seeing where we can work together. I agree with you. The thing that we're not combining is thinking how greater engagement economically between Russia and China in the Arctic, and I think China has a very long-term strategic economic vision for the Arctic. That's why they're focusing their investments in Iceland, because that is the natural port after you do the transpolar route to go into North America, Europe as a trading hub, their mining activities in Greenland with rare earths. I think we tend to exaggerate in some ways China's footprint. I'm not overly concerned about it, but I think now we have to start investing in understanding their interest, keeping those communications open. Their science is growing in the Arctic. Their footprint is growing in the Arctic. We need to have a conversation about it, and I'd like to see us think about that more strategically.
No, I do think that it should be mentioned, but in defense of the DoD paper, it really is looking at the defense interests.
Right.
And I think this is, again, where we have to, put the packet of straws away. And we need to begin to think in terms of where do economics and security come together and look at regions in that way. And I think that, looking at China from the perspective of its economic interests and also from its governance interests. China obviously supportive of UNCLOS, but we've seen in places where China is not complying with UNCLOS. So how does China want to see the Arctic governed? In conversations I've had with officials there, they kind of like the Antarctic model. Kind of a UN type of focus. Is that in our best interest? And I would say that those two schemes are very different. The way that I characterize the two places is the Antarctic is a continent surrounded by water, and the Arctic is an ocean surrounded by continents. And so the organizational structures, the governance needs to change. And I think China and the US may have different views on that. What are they? And I think it is appropriate in the strategic documents to include China in there, if for no other reason than the growth of China, its economy, and what it may wish to do militarily. I would also say that the other thing that we have to look at is the relationship of Japan and Russia, and the energy that will be being pulled from Russia, and we already know that they're in dialogue about that. It's, Japan wants to have some alternative sources of energy. Russia is going to be one of those. And then how will that set up the strategic relationships in Northeast Asia in a very different way? And I would submit that our strategy documents need to be a fusing of economic and security interests.
Okay, let's. You want to comment on that, and I'll let you do the what keeps you up at night question.
Well, I think just to say what the Admiral pointed out is correct, and I think it just proves the point that as soon as this report hits the table, it'll be in some ways obsolete because we know we're going to need to build on that for yet another report that has much more of this strategic view without the soda straws. Again, as the Admiral was talking about Japan, we talked about Canada, we talked about Europe, we talked about Alaska. We're just within the OSD policy, you're crossing all the geographic offices.
Right, doesn't fit.
So the idea, I'm looking at Rob, who worked in the office with me, who was also newly liberated.
Congratulations.
The idea that this would come out of one person in the Europe office,
right,
is just, that's a soda straw. And so I'm glad we're no longer at the pamphlet stage. I'm glad it's a better document. It's got a classified annex, which I haven't read in a while. But we now, with the new administration, needs to then build on top of that and try to figure this out in a much more integrated and sophisticated way, looking at regions, geographic regions, as well as the other aspects that make this something that crosses seams of resources and boundaries and geography and military COCOMs. We've got to do another version.
Well, I've argued this is the new diplomacy. This is where you have to think not just the regions and the, through the economic lens or the governance lens or the security lens. You've got to look at it all. It's got to all work together. You got to know what you want, which is almost our greatest challenge. You've got to then put those resources and prioritize it. But this is the new diplomacy, and we are struggling with it, and we've struggled with it for the last several years. All right, we got 2 minutes barely. What keeps you up at night about the Arctic and security?
That we're so far behind, that we're behind. We need to be smart about this. It's not just writing checks and pouring forces in without thinking about it. We've got to come up with an approach that makes sense within the context that we have on the ground today globally for the U.S., for the U.S. military particularly, looking at this just from the defense lens. And what keeps me up is that there's so much to do, and there's so many other things to do as well, that we won't get to it until it's too late. I mean, what the Admiral said, and this the horrible feeling you have when something happens that you've predicted and that you weren't quite able to get all the preparations done to deal with. The event happens, like a cruise vessel that needs to be, search and rescue that needs to be done for more than 50 people. And we say we can't get there. It's going to take 6 days, and people look at us and go, "You've got to be kidding me! That's like the Titanic in 1912. Yeah. Can't we do better than that?" And so that's what keeps me up at night. Not just about the Arctic, but other areas too. There's a lot of work we've got to do, but it also calls for hard decisions because it's going to require money. And there's a lot of other claimants within the United States for U.S. government resources, infrastructure of all kinds. I mean, so there's a lot to do, and so we've got to be smart about this and not just sit and write a check. We've got to sit down there and figure this out.
Yeah, I would say that the thing that bothers me is the lack of an integrated approach and strategy and structure to look at what is going to be a hugely important part of our future economy going forward. So that's one. And the thing that I worried about most and continue to worry about that I touched on, and it was a series of events. Remember when the cruise ship ran aground in Italy?
And all those people
jumped off? Well, the day after that happened, someone came in and showed me the neat picture of a massive cruise ship winding its way through the ice floes. And the first words that came to mind were too salty for me to say here in public. But I looked at that and I saw what had happened in Italy in that benign environment, and the outcome will not be the same. It would be a major maritime disaster, and if it involves American citizens, it will get to exactly what Jim said. Why weren't you ready, and what were you thinking? And it would be a huge national embarrassment.
Well, I said in the beginning, this was the best way to kick off our 2017 Arctic programming. And I failed to mention when I introduced you, sir, that my favorite title for you is member of the Advisory Council of the Stewart Center, which is our new research center that houses our Arctic research. Thank you so much for making a special trip to be with us today. And Jim Townsend, thank you for your service. We're glad to have you back on the outside so you can help us push on an Arctic strategy.
To be here.
Thank you so much, and please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for a great discussion.
Thanks, Heather.
Fabulous.